Ruth 1, 6 through 9 picks up after the tragic events recorded in the first 5 verses of the book. Instead of covering a decade or more, these 4 verses describe a conversation between Naomi and her 2 Moabite daughters-in-law. Before we begin, make sure you download the worksheet, read the passage several times, make your own observations, and then watch the rest of the video and compare your notes. Ruth 1, 6 through 9. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. Ruth 1, verse 6. It's hard to translate into English, but this verse is all about Naomi's action. Her daughters-in-law are with her, but the author wants the reader's full attention focused on Naomi. She is the subject of nearly all the verbs in the verse. The verse refers to Moab twice. In fact, these are the 4th and 5th references to Moab in the book's first 6 verses. It's safe to say that the author wants you to pay attention to the Moab detail in the story. We'll need to keep this in mind as the rest of the story plays out. We should also notice the reference to food in this verse. The Hebrew word lechem, which means bread or food. If you remember from the notes on Ruth 1 verse 1, Bethlehem, literally Beit Lechem, means house of bread. So this verse means that Naomi heard that God was restoring food to the house of bread. Ruth 1 verse 7. The phrase "where she was" repeats a similar phrase in Ruth 1 verse 2. The only difference is that verse 2 referred to Naomi, her husband, and her sons. Here in verse 7, it refers only to Naomi and her daughters-in-law, who are widows. The reference to Naomi's daughters-in-law is not just an observation about who was living with Naomi. In the absence of her husbands and her sons, Naomi was in charge of these 2 women. She was responsible for them. They were under her care. As we will see in the next few verses, Naomi does not think that arrangement is good for them or even for her. Until the phrase "they went on the way," Naomi was the primary actor in verses 6 and 7. She was the subject of all the verbs. And finally, the women do something together. After the tragic events she endured in Moab, Naomi is finally going to return to her homeland. She left with a husband and 2 sons. She begins her journey back with 2 daughters-in-law and no male figure in the family, a precarious situation in their ancient patriarchal society. Ruth 1 verse 8. Naomi tells her daughters-in-law to return to their mother's house. The house of the mother in the ancient Near East was sometimes a smaller family unit within the house of the father. It was often a place of marriage negotiation. So in effect, Naomi is telling Orpah and Ruth to go and start their lives over again. Even as Naomi tells the women to return to their families, she invokes Israel's God over their lives. The idea of God dealing kindly with them conveys the Hebrew word chesed, which means something like covenant faithfulness. It's even more striking because Naomi is someone who doesn't seem to think that God has dealt kindly with her or shown her covenant faithfulness. We're never told how Orpah and Ruth navigated the tragedy of losing their husbands, nor are we told what they did for Naomi during this time. We do know, however, that Naomi felt honored by them. She thanks them for the way they treated, quote, the dead and her. It's just a reminder of the deep tragedy that these women have walked through. Ruth 1 verse 9. English translations are wonderful, but sometimes they smooth out awkward sentences. And most translations do just that with this verse. There's another way to translate Ruth 1 verse 9 that gets at the idea a little better, in my opinion, than the typical English translation. And here it is. May the Lord give to you find rest, each woman in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they left their voices and wept. In Hebrew, this verse starts with a blessing, but the blessing is left incomplete. It seems that Naomi sort of stops in the middle of this blessing statement. Instead of trying to act pious and, holier than thou, Naomi shifts in direction. She doesn't finish the blessing. She just tells the woman she hopes they will find rest with another husband. In order for the women to find security with another husband, they need to leave Naomi. And this way, Naomi's command to the women will result in her own isolation even more. She already lost her husband and her sons, and now she's giving away her daughters-in-law. In case you missed the emotional tragedy these women faced, Ruth 1 verse 9 describes all three of them as weeping. They weep because of their loss, and they weep because their futures look so bleak. The tragic events recorded in Ruth 1 through 5 cover at least a decade. Verses 6 through 9 slow down dramatically. They cover events that likely happened in the matter of days or weeks. The famine in the land of Judah ends, and Naomi decides to return to her own country. Before doing so, however, she insists that her daughters-in-law return to their own homes and start their lives over. If you didn't already feel the weight of the tragedy Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth endured, the final phrase in verse 9 brings it all to the surface. They wept. Sometimes weeping together is the only way to move through difficult seasons in life. If you enjoyed this content, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a video. We'll be walking through the book of Ruth verse by verse. Make sure that you subscribe and follow along.